In this talk, I will not give a history of music in Iran in the first decade of the Islamic Revolution, the decade that is usually known as the revolutionary decade. That has been done by other people more competently, and I refer you to the book by Nahid Siamdoust, Soundtrack of the Revolution, which was published by Stanford University Press in 2017. My approach is more analytical, and you will see what I mean by this as I go on. The paper that I have in front of me is going to be published in December, probably in a huge edited volume that I'm doing with Nahid Siamdoust. And for the purpose of this talk, if I wanted to give the entire lecture, we'd still be here at 10 o'clock and I would miss my flight. So I have to cut things. The topic is, I will first explain the topic and then proceed to the material itself. In a short article, Yusuf Islam, the artist known as Cat Stevens before he converted to Islam, begins by stating, one of the things which it is necessary to clarify is the legal position of music in connection with the teachings of Islam. But he is cautious. He writes, it appears that song and singing are lawful, but they can become unlawful, abominable, or laudable according to time, circumstance, place, style, content, or motive. Then he says that everything is clear in Islam, but concludes that a lot more thought has to go into this area, i.e. music, and a lot more development, because there are songs and singing in Islam, there is melody as well as drums, but it has to be within limits. So now Yusuf Islam's apparent contradiction, everything is clear in Islam, but we don't know what the status of music is, points to a major dilemma. For after 14 centuries, there's still no consensus among Muslims what precisely these limits are. And it's because of this lack of consensus that music emerged as a major issue in Iranian politics after the revolution of 1979. Now, one reason for this is that there is no clear definition of music. I mean, we all think we know what music is, beautiful sounds produced on instruments or by the human voice. But in the context of the Sharia, music, not every sound art is music. Not every beautiful sound produced by the human voice is music. For instance, the call to prayer, the azan, or the cantillation of the Quran partake of the same musical theories as Iranian art music, yet nobody calls them music. So they don't come under the prohibition. And so where exactly the border is between sound art that is beautiful to listen to, but that is considered music, and sound art that is beautiful to listen to, but is not considered music, is a fuzzy line. And hence the politics that I'm going to talk about today. Now, the general rule of thumb is that in Twelver Shiism, the official religion of the state, music is quite suspect. It is suspect because it may lead to sinful behavior. This is what in Catholic theology is called an occasion for sin. It's not a sin itself, but it leads to sinning. And the sins in this case are sex and drugs. Even in European history, we have the triad wine, women, and song. Wine, women, and song, updated as sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Right? And if you look at the tapestries or the paintings in Isfahan, you always see people playing instruments, women dancing, and cups of wine. So the three go together. And it's for that reason, the reason that, that music could lead to illicit behavior, that it is suspect. Now, the question is, if music is suspect for the ulama of Twelver Shiism, how come music has survived at all in Iran over the last 500 years since Twelver Shiism became the official religion of the state? Well, a number of reasons. First of all, not all Iranians are Muslims. And in fact, Iran's musical traditions were safeguarded and transmitted from one generation to another by Jews. Until quite recently, the shops that sold musical instruments in Tehran were in the Jewish quarter, in the Mahalleh. Not all Iranian Muslims are Twelver Shiites. And among the Sunnis, the prohibition is much less strict than among Twelver Shiites. Not all Twelver Shiites are deeply religious. There are people who have a lighter understanding of religion. And even among Twelver Shiites, the Sufi orders, for instance, have always practiced music in one way or the other. Especially at the highest level of the state, namely at the level of the king, music was very much patronized by the rulers, because the rulers in every country in the world think of themselves as being above the kind of rules and laws that normal people, regular people, have to abide by. And that explains the survival of music in a country whose official religion is hostile to it. Now, all of this, of course, changes in 1979 when the professionals of that hostile group become the leaders of the country, right? And here I'm talking in particular of Ayatollah Khomeini, which brings me to the second term I want to explain, after having explained that music is not as clear-cut a thing as we think it is, and that is charismatic authority. The sight of the millions of people who greeted the Ayatollah Khomeini at the airport in Tehran in early 1979 and then attended his speeches and rallies revived interest in the sociological concept of charisma. What is charismatic authority? And here I want to quote from the great sociologist Max Weber, who defined the charismatic leader as, I quote, "the natural leader in times of psychic, physical, economic, ethical, religious, and political distress," who, again I quote, "seizes the task at hand that is adequate for him and demands obedience." Now, Weber continues that genuine charismatic domination knows of no abstract legal codes. It doesn't go by the rule. Adding that, quote, "its attitude is revolutionary and transvalues everything. It makes a sovereign break with all traditional or rational norms." It makes a break with what has been going on. It makes a break with everything that people take for granted. And this is precisely my topic today, because as I'll show, Khomeini broke with centuries of Sharia by rendering music legal, or at least some parts of it. And how this happened is the topic of my talk today. Because other religious leaders did not disappear when Khomeini appeared on the scene. While the state had the power to enforce Khomeini's pronouncements in the official realm, other interpretations of music did not fade away. And there were always debates. Is music good? Is it not good? Should the state enforce its prohibition? Should the state not enforce its prohibition? And these debates did not take place in a vacuum, but in a society that was in revolutionary turmoil and in which religious commitment was neither uniform nor universal. Therefore, disagreements appeared. Now, my first point will be about music and revolution, the idea of music and the idea of revolution. The revolutionaries of 1978 and 1979, whether Islamist or leftist, were united in their opposition to the Shah's cultural policies, which, according to them, favored mubtazal, meaning vulgar or degenerate, and gharbzadeh, west-struck, forms of artistic expression at the expense of authentic, asil, ones. Why would they do that? Because according to the revolutionaries, the Pahlavi regime wanted to corrupt the young and distract them from the real issues facing the country, namely despotism, imperialism, injustice, and corruption. Why? So as to facilitate Iran's exploitation by the evil West. Now, Iranian revolutions were hardly unique in this attitude. Closer to our own time, Lenin, the leader of the Bolsheviks, who was himself a music lover, said that one should not listen to music too often, as it, quote, affects the nerves, makes you want to say kind, silly things, to stroke the heads of the people who, living in a terrible hell, can create such beauty. If you like music, you will be nice to musicians. And he concludes that nowadays you mustn't stroke anybody's head. You've got your hand bitten off. You've got to hit them over the heads without mercy, although ideally we are against the use of force. So even Lenin, who basically was a great music lover, was suspicious of music. Now, in the Middle Ages, in Europe, the same attitude can be found. There was a cleric in Renaissance Florence by the name of Girolamo Savonarola who dedicated his action to the eradication of corruption, despotic rules, the exploitation of the poor, etc. And so what did his followers do? They created a huge bonfire with cosmetics, art, books, fine dresses, playing cards, and musical instruments. And even manuscripts of secular songs were burned. Since then, this has been called the Bonfire of Vanities. In the same vein, in the course of Usman Danfodio's early 19th century jihad that culminated in the establishment of the Fulani Empire in Central Africa, now the north of Nigeria, more or less, quote, almost all sorts of musical instruments and activities were banned in the name of reforming pre-Islamic mores that had persisted in the Muslim states subdued by the jihad. So we get the jihad of caliphate, burning instruments and so on. The Wahhabis in the Arabian Peninsula strongly opposed music, so much so that when Ottoman Egyptian forces conquered the first Saudi state, the torture they meted out to Abdul Wahhab's grandson before they executed him. They tortured him before they executed him. And what was this torture? They made him listen to music. And in the early 20th century, when the militant Ikhwan allied with Al Saud to create the third Saudi state, today's Saudi Arabia, King Abdulaziz allowed them to destroy his prized gramophone in order to consolidate their allegiance with him. He loved his gramophone, but to get the support, he had the gramophone destroyed. Now, why are revolutionaries so opposed to music? This is, as you can see, this is a universal phenomenon that we are witnessing. And I think the reason is that music is without a political content. I mean, if you listen to an Indian raga or to a Beethoven quartet, nothing in it is either conservative or liberal or leftist, etc. It's absolute art. And that's precisely what revolutionaries abhor. Revolutionaries want art to be committed. Now, the only committed music is music that has words that are committed. Songs can be committed. But an instrumental piece is not in and of itself revolutionary or conservative. And that's precisely what renders it, I think, suspicious in the eyes of people who believe that every artistic endeavor has to be in the name of an overarching ideal to which they want society to progress. Now, the opposition of the clergy in Iran to music does not begin with the Islamic Revolution. It's after the constitutional revolution of 1906, 1907 that music emerges in the public sphere. in Iran with concerts, with cafes, where they have music, and so on. And of course, this takes place under the dictatorship of Reza Shah. And in his first book, in Khomeini's first book, Kashf al-Asrar, which he writes after Reza Shah's abdication, he criticizes the introduction of music into schools in these terms. He writes, "Music induces the spirit of love-making and lust in humans." Back to Wine, Women, and Song. And does away with valor, courage, and chivalry. It is forbidden by the law and the Sharia and must not be part of the school curriculum. So he is on record for opposing music, even before he comes to power. And then throughout the 1950s, the Fadayan Islam and other fundamentalist groups in Iran speak up against music in their writings and so on. So much so that in the 1950s, the school directors in the south of Tehran, the more traditionally oriented parts of Tehran, advised music teachers not to bring instruments to class because they could be attacked on the street if they're seen with a violin under their arm, and so on. And of course, this all becomes an even bigger phenomenon once you have radio and television. Because it's one thing to have a few musicians going around and performing for 10 or 12 people. It's another thing to have radio and television broadcasting music to the homes of everybody. Right? And so much of the religious criticism of the regime in the 1950s and 60s and 70s centers on radio and television. That radio and television broadcast music. Now, oddly enough, it's not only the clerics who are against it, but also some of these so-called modernist ideologues like Ali Shariati. Ali Shariati, of course, divides all art between art that is decadent and for the elites and art that is good and for the people. Muta'ahid, the notion of committed art. And he writes very strange things. He writes, for instance, that good art is exemplified by Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, which brought tears to the cheek of the Iron Chancellor Bismarck. How he knows that Bismarck cried when he listened to the Fifth Symphony, I don't know, but he claimed that that was the case. And examples of bad music are the music that is played in cabarets, dance hall, La Lézard theaters, as well as the music of the Black Cats, an early Iranian pop group, the Beatles, Johnny Hallyday, a French singer, and Elvis Presley. And he goes on saying that Elvis Presley was sent to Germany by the Americans to undermine the warrior spirits of the Germans. The fact is that Elvis Presley did his military service in Germany. He wasn't sent to undermine anything, right? Now, I just want to show that the issue of music is not only related to the clergy. And therefore, with the benefit of hindsight, the attempt to eliminate all music from the airwaves was not as astonishing as one might think. Conflict over music broke out soon after the fall of the monarchy in February 1979. Very early on, frivolous or mubtazal music was banned from the broadcast media, but this did not satisfy the clerics, and as a result, a tug of war broke out over the proper place, if any, of music in public life, especially on radio and television. Within the ruling clergy, opinion differed. Ayatollah Muhammad Beheshti, for instance, who was very influential in the early months of the revolution before he was killed in 1981, was quite in favor of music. Why? Because he had lived in Germany and had experienced sacred music in churches, and had come to appreciate the role of music in spiritual life. The locus of this conflict, the arena, became radio and television. And in the early weeks of the revolution, of course, there was what in good Persian we call khar to khar, namely, we don't know what's going on. But then in the summer of 1979, Khomeini issued clear orders, as we will see. And these orders were issued in the context of a radio station that had appeared in Iran since 1972 in the resort areas of the north of the country, Radio Darya. Radio Darya was broadcast from Charlus on the shores of the Caspian Sea. And in the summer months, only in the summer months, it broadcast music, traffic reports, and local information, and was very popular among young vacationers who were its target audience. Uniquely in Iran, the station also aired advertisements for alcoholic beverages. In the spring of 1979, so we are in the early months of the revolution, with the summer holiday season in sight, the local hotel owners and restaurant owners wanted to make sure that they are in business during the summer. And so they sent a delegation of citizens from Charlus to Qom to see Sheikh Mohammad Yazdi, a cleric whom they knew because he was from the area, to ask him to allow that Radio Darya resume its broadcasting because they wanted vacationers to come. And then Yazdi approached two younger clerics. One of whom was going to make a career for himself and now lives in Germany, Hassan Yousefi Eshkevari, to take over the radio station. They move to Charlus, and they collaborate with the personnel of Radio Sari and Radio Rasht to produce 6 hours of programming every day for Radio Darya. They discarded quote-unquote frivolous music, but not classical music or folk music. So folk songs were still performed, even folk songs performed by women, and the personnel of the station were the same. I mean, the people, the technicians, the speakers, etc., they were the same. They just had a different set of bosses, namely these two clerics. And they were unhappy with this. They wanted the old style of music to appear. So there is sort of tension at the headquarters of Radio Darya. And to assuage the grumbling, Ashkevari and his colleague decide to take everybody to Qom and see Khomeini. So they take a minibus, they rent a minibus, they go to Qom and see the Imam to ascertain what they are supposed to do. Because the Iranian constitution now says that all government policy have to be in line with Islam. Islam isn't clear about music, so you tell us. That's the idea. And on July 21st, 1979, Khomeini meets with the delegation. And the first thing he says is that non-divine political regimes, such as the overthrown monarchy, attempted to corrupt the young using radio, television, cinema, with the aim of distracting them from the vital problems of the day. This is pure Shariati. Vital problems of the day. In other words, problems that I think are important. Now, one of the things he says that intoxicate young people's minds is music. And he tells them when a person has listened for a while to music, their brain becomes different from that of a serious person. It expels one from reality and turns one's attention to different matters. And then he admonishes them, and I quote, "If you want your country to be a correct country, a free country, an independent country, take matters seriously from now on. Make radio and television instructive. Eliminate music. Don't fear being called old-fashioned." So they are stunned. They didn't expect this. So they return to Charlus, thinking that they have the only recording of Khomeini's speech. And so they excise, they cut out the critical parts and broadcast the rest. In other words, they try to censor Khomeini. except that what they didn't know was that there had been another recording, and that is broadcast that evening over national radio. So the entire country now knows that Khomeini wants music to be eliminated. So they were in a bind. What do we do now? And in compliance with Khomeini's wish, the head of the music section of radio television in Tehran, NIRT, National Iranian Radio and Television, Television Milliye Iran, issued a directive in which he advised producers and tone engineers that henceforth only revolutionary anthems, suroods, and marches could be broadcast over the airwaves. And they put together a list of songs that could be played. And here again we get the semantic confusion. A surood is not music. Musiri is supposed to disappear, but surood, by this definition, is not music, right? And then finally, on March 7th, 1980, a few months later, Khomeini issues a concise and unambiguous fatwa in answer to the question, what kind of music is allowed in Iran? And his answer is very pithy. Music is absolutely forbidden. Absolutely forbidden, right? Now, this is Khomeini, the cleric. In private, he was quite different. When his disciple, Ayatollah Mortaza Motahhari, was assassinated in May 1979, a song was composed in his memory which actually moved Khomeini. He said so. Similarly, when a cassette recording of a piece by the symphonic composer Mortaza Hannaneh was played for him, he said there's nothing wrong with this. And it's for that reason that music never completely disappeared from the airwaves. Because banning music from the airwaves would have been very difficult in practice. How can you have a program about animals in Africa without a soundtrack of music behind it, right? How can you have a Czech cartoon without music in the background? So radio and broadcast still broadcast music, radio and television. Also, during demonstrations, the Islamists sang suroods, sang songs, in competition with the leftists. The leftists had taken Latin American leftist songs and given Persian letters to it. If the leftists sing, we have to sing too. And therefore, the Surood Enqelabi, the revolutionary anthem, remained part and parcel of government policy regarding mass mobilization, right? So, in other words, a government which in theory was supposed to uphold all the strictures of Twelver Shiism was in practice disregarding them here and there, right? And this led to first of all, the government tried to find a way to have music without calling it. So, for instance, in the Ministry of Culture, the administration of music became the administration of revolutionary anthems. Idare Soud va Ahanghay Enqelabi. This was supposed to supervise the country's musical life. The 6/8 beat was forbidden. The 6/8 beat, the reng, is what some people call the mother milk of Iranian music. It's a very popular kind of beat in Iranian music, and yet officially they try to forbid it. Why? Because the 6/8 beat is the music that Iranians dance to. It has other uses too, but when Iranians dance, it's very often to the 6/8 beat. For the majority of musicians, life became very difficult. Sayyid Jawad Zabihi, one of Iran's most accomplished vocalists, who knew the canon of Persian music, but who performed mostly religious chants and prayers, actually, He was bicultural, if you like, was first arrested and then savagely murdered in July 1981 by orders of Sadegh Khalkhali, the notorious hanging judge. What was his sin? What was he executed for? He had performed in the presence of the Shah. This was one of the country's greatest musicians. All sorts of indignities were visited on those who survived, professional or amateur. Pop musicians who stayed in Iran were forbidden to perform, and if they did and were found out, they were punished. The popular singer Ne'matullah Aghasi, some of you are old enough to remember Amene. Ne'matullah Aghasi was condemned to 50 whiplashes and for having participated in a party with alcohol and gambling. He was whipped in public. When the highly respected singer of classical Persian music, Ghulam Hussein Banan, died, he was refused burial in Tehran's main cemetery and had to be laid to rest in a distant suburb. A very deep humiliation felt by musicians in Iran who admired him greatly, because he had not been a cabaret performer. He had not performed frivolous music. So the result was that music, either listening to it or playing it or learning an instrument, became a symbol of resistance to the regime. It's a resistance to the official asceticism, but also a way to spend one's time in a society from which puritanical rulers had banned most public entertainments. So what do? You play sitar at home. Iranian art music is a very intimate genre, and so professional musicians retreated to the privacy of their homes to teach. And the number of students they had grew exponentially. So by the mid-1980s, music had not disappeared, and musicians began to test the limits of what was allowed and what was not allowed. Of course, the pop music, which nowadays is called Los Angelesi music, there was no room for that, but classical Persian music was a different story. And so there are two events that mark this period. One is Shah Jaryan's Bidad in 1985, and the other one is in October 1985, a recording by mostly Kurdish musicians commemorating the 800th anniversary of the birth of Rumi. And these two cassettes became incredibly popular. Every Iranian household has them. So the persistence of music in public life, even in a very limited way, could not fail to arouse the anger of the most culturally conservative elements. In March 1980, Ayatollah Hassan Tabatabai Qomi of Mashhad, a major Ayatollah in Mashhad, had already complained that demonstrators had entered the shrine of the 8th Imam singing suroods. Revolutionary Islamic suroods. But still, for him, being very conservative, this was still music. But he fell in disfavor and was under house arrest until his death in 2007. The incessant grumbling of conservatives, this is what conservative clerics in Iran have always done. They grumble. On the one hand, and the complaints of more modern citizens who wanted entertaining programs on radio and television put the leadership of state radio television in a bind. On the one hand, if you have more music, the conservatives will complain. If you have less music, the public will complain, right? Now, the head of the music establishment on radio and television was Mohammad Hashemi, who was a younger brother of Ali Akbar Rafsanjani, who was a very important politician in the 1980s and 90s, head of parliament, speaker of parliament, and then president. Now, the younger Hashemi had spent some time as a student in California, and was somewhat more open-minded than everybody else. And in 1982, he admitted that his organization faced an acute lack of experts and was incapable of producing a broad range of programs, because many of the people who had been producing radio and television programs had been sacked, most of them had been purged. The grumbling goes on. The head of radio television complains about not knowing what to do. And then in 1987, a book comes out called Music in History and in the Quran. And to show the readers that he had done his homework and was not an old-fashioned fuddy-duddy, the author provides a short history of music and culled from secondary sources, and to show that he's open-minded, he talks about the music of other countries, and he said approvingly, very approvingly, that in the 15th century in the city of Florence, Mr. Savonarola, whom I just mentioned earlier, a religious leader, ordered all musical instruments to be burned in public places to improve public morality. So from Savonarola to the Islamic Republic, there's a direct line. And then he gives all sorts of examples. For instance, he says Tolstoy hated opera because he thought it spread corruption, and so on and so forth. His argument is very detailed, and I have it in my article, but I won't go into detail. Then another polemic article appeared in the Islamic Republic's Air Force journal, which tried to become medical. Here the author writes, because of its countless vibrations, music directly affects the nerves. When music is joyous or sad, the equilibrium between sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves is broken, which harms digestion, the absorption of liquids, heartbeat, and blood pressure, and thus readies the body for sometimes incurable diseases. So, in other words, listen to music and you get an incurable disease, right? In October 1987, an article in the conservative newspaper Risalat complains that the government had not issued clear regulations about music and invited the authorities to define the religious criteria that distinguish permissible from forbidden music. The debate that has been going on for 13 centuries, essentially. And the article adds, in an Islamic society, one cannot allow people to play and sing what they want, and permit any company to sell to the public any tape it wants. The government's silence on this important matter signals approval. Sukut alamat rezas. The government's silence signals approval as music stores grow like mushrooms on every street corner selling all sorts of music. The sellers are emboldened seeing that they are left alone, and the people conclude that if these tapes were religiously objectionable, the government would not permit their sale. So it's misleading because people will believe that Islam actually accepts these tapes, these videotapes, these audio tapes, because if they were forbidden, they wouldn't be sold, right? So these complaints continue. And at one point, Hashemi has had enough of this grumbling and decides to ask Khomeini himself. And he asks Khomeini to clarify 3 issues. Is it all right for television to show films in which women are not fully covered, like Western films? 2, is it allowed to broadcast sports programs in which men are not fully covered, like the thighs of football players, for instance? And is it all right to watch such programs? And Khomeini answers very quickly, watching these kinds of films and plays is religiously unobjectionable. Unobjectionable. Many of them are educational, and broadcasting them is unobjectionable. The same holds for sports coverage. Likewise, the songs are mostly unobjectionable. There are some rare exceptions, and some caution is in order. But viewers must decide for themselves. If watching these things produces lust in them, then they must stop watching. So it's up to the believer who decide what's objectionable and what is permissible, right? And then this is still not clear enough. So in early 1988, the head of the Fars office, Shiraz, Fars office of the Ministry of Culture and Islamic Guidance, Irshad, submits 9 questions regarding music to Khomeini, asking him to remove the uncertainties concerning some contentious issues. Now, Khomeini issues 9 fatwas in response. And these are actually important enough, so I'm going to read all of them. He says, 1, while motrebi music, what is motrebi music? Joyful music. While joyful music is forbidden, the determination as to what music is motrebi or joyful is based on customary criteria. What does this mean? This means that it's for the listener to decide. It's for the listener to decide if the music is joyful or not, and if he decides it's joyful, he must tone down the radio. It is permissible to teach music, and this had an effect, of course, on the reopening of conservatories, at music departments, etc. It's permissible to teach permissible music. Permitted music can be instrumental only. So singing is still questionable. Instruments used only for forbidden music must be avoided, but it is permissible to use dual-purpose instruments, i.e. instruments that are used for both permissible and for forbidden music. Music can be performed live in front of an audience. A man can sing solo in front of an audience. If the collective singing of women induces corruption, it must be avoided. So the implication is that solo singing for women is forbidden, which is still the case today officially. Men and women can perform together, provided it does not induce corruption. And for Western music, the same rules apply. So, in other words, this is a break with 13 centuries of fiqh, of Sharia. And Khomeini's rulings were immediately celebrated by Rafsanjani, who was then Speaker of Parliament, and whose brother had started the ball rolling, as a victory of pure and progressive Islam against dogmatic traditionalism. However, of course, the dogmatic traditionalists did not disarm. And they confirmed that even if music is broadcast by the radio and television of the Islamic Republic, it still remains forbidden for their followers. And so a few weeks later, a young cleric from Rome, Muhammad Hassan Ghadiri, challenges Khomeini by saying that the 6th Imam, Jafar Sadiq, who was one of the founders of Shiite jurisprudence, had totally forbidden music. And in his response, Khomeini lashes out against conservative ulama. And on October 24th, 1988, he criticizes the author of this complaint and tells him that he needs to go with the times. And again, the reasoning is important for other reasons as well, so I'm going to read it for you. Before getting to your questions, I have to express my regret over your interpretation of divine laws. According to your views, anfal, namely bringing unused lands under cultivation, would mean that today too, Shiites can clear forests, destroy the environment, and endanger the lives of millions of people without anybody being able to stop them. Homes and mosques whose sites are needed for planning purposes to solve traffic problems and save the lives of thousands of people could not be torn down, etc. According to your interpretation of divine laws, modern civilization would have to disappear completely. And people would have to become cave dwellers. So this is the anti-conservative view. And then Khomeini refutes Qadiri's argument about the illicitness of music and says, well, there are many aspects to this question which I have neither the time nor am I in the right mood to address. In other words, forget about the Sharia, right? I mean, I don't have time for this type of thing. And then he ends by giving Qadiri the fatherly advice to consider only God and not allow himself to be influenced by stupid bigots and illiterate akhunds. Akhund is the Persian pejorative term for mullahs, right? So here's Khomeini telling people, don't go by these traditional akhunds. Now, Khomeini's answer is interesting for a number of reasons, these 9 fatwas that I mentioned. First, it illustrates his disdain for the traditional ulama, whom he calls akhund. Second, he does not provide any doctrinal reasoning. He has broken with centuries of jurisprudence before, for instance, when he declared that caviar was halal. But in that case, there was a careful study of seeing whether the sturgeon had scales or did not have scales, etc. In this case, I just don't have the time to deal with it, right? And this is really quite typical of charismatic authority. Because Max Weber writes, charismatic authority is the following, quote, "It has been written, but I say unto you." This is, of course, a quote from the Bible. It has been written, but I say unto you. It has been written that music is forbidden, but I say it's okay. That's the essence of charismatic authority, hence the title of my talk. Third, Khomeini acknowledges the weight of changed circumstances. This flexibility is also manifest in his response to his objection. I mean, somebody objects that what you now declare to be all right was forbidden before the revolution. So have you changed your mind? And this he dismisses by saying that depends on the circumstances. If the music that is allowed in Iran were played on Saudi radio, I would consider it illegal. If it was broadcast under the Shah, it would be illegal, but now it's not. Changed circumstances, right? So at this point, music began flooding public spaces. Even Islamist bookstores, bookstores that sell the books of the Sepah Pastaran, for instance, provided background, as we say in America, music for their customers. Many observant people who followed Khomeini in religious matters, his muqallids, were now relieved to know that they were not singing when they were listening to music. It also liberalized the artistic atmosphere in Iran, and the man who supervised this opening in the sort of atmosphere was the Minister of Culture since 1982, Mohammad Khatami, who later became president. Concerts of Iranian art music appeared. Conservatories and music departments were opened. Musicians opened private music schools. And the conservatives continued grumbling. So I'm only going to mention one thing. There is one there was one cleric who wrote a 650-page book refuting the idea that music is permissible in Iran. And believe it or not, I have read all 650 pages. And one interesting thing about it is that the objectionability of music was always based on the human voice. That listening to a woman singing solo would excite a man too much. So it's ghina, it's the singing. That's why Khomeini says instrumental music is all right. And of course, the point is that in classical Persian music, singing is very important. Instrumental music is relatively recent. So, and this man, this ultra-conservative who publishes this beautiful leather-bound book, says no. Instrumental music is also forbidden. How do we know? And I'll try to find the quote in my papers here, because it's worth giving you in total. He quotes from the beginning of the Masnavi of Rumi, and hang on, yeah. What is the Beshno Azne, etc.? In English, it is, listen to the reed, how it tells a tale, complaining of separations, saying, ever since I was parted from the reed bed, my lament has caused men and women to moan. Now, the conclusion that this conservative cleric draws is that, see, even instrumental music can remove listeners from reality. Because they listen to a flute, to a reed flute, to a ney, and they cause men and women to moan. Therefore, no exception for instrumental music. Instrumental music must be forbidden as well, right? But of course, charismatic authority always trumps traditional authority, and so the state does not end its tolerance of music, except, of course, that with Khomeini's successor, things are not as clear as that, because Khomeini lacked the charisma of Khomeini. And so beginning in 1990, 1991, the government very soon, in the mid-90s, becomes a little bit more stringent and continues making life miserable for musicians in many cases. They never quite outlaw it because they can't go against Khomeini's command, but they can restrict music. So it can happen in Iran, for instance, that the authorities give permission for a concert to take place, and then the local Friday player leader cancels the concert. So there is a constant tug of war between musicians and the government, precisely because Khomeini, who actually has a reputation of being a music lover, rumor has it in Iran that he has private concerts where people play for him, etc., doesn't have the charismatic authority of Khomeini to go against centuries of Sharia. And in order not to be contested by those clerics who are of a higher rank than him, who are more educated than him, he has to satisfy them to some extent. But the ultimate result of all of this is that music has been strengthened in Iran. And this, again, can be studied in a comparative complex. The Savonarola that I just mentioned on 2 occasions was first hanged and then burnt as a heretic in 1498. And thereafter, both music, both sacred and secular, flourished in Italy as it did in few other countries. In what is now northern Nigeria, after the jihad of Usman Dan Fodio, European travelers witnessed a lively musical scene, only a few years later. And in Iran, too, music has emerged from the debates of the 1980s and 1990s stronger than ever before. I mean, I would argue that more people now in Iran play an instrument, listen to music, know about music, are knowledgeable about music than ever before. And the proliferation of different genres is mind-boggling. The music of the peripheral areas in Iran, of the ethnic minorities, has now become part of the mainstream. People claim to play medieval music all the way to hip-hop and so on, jazz. So in a sense, the suspicion and the ill reputation that attended to musicianship in Iran until the 1950s, where motreb was a dirty word, has completely disappeared. And Iranians play more music and sing more music than I think ever before in their history. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your fascinating talk. I have a question here. Last year I had the chance to talk with the medical professor at the Stanford Medical School that are specialists about epilepsy. And we were discussing Muhammad's partial complex epilepsy that is well known in the medical schools.
Yeah.
He said it calls divine disease. And Dr. Abbasi Sadeqian, American Iranian doctor, neuropsychiatrist, wrote books about sword and seizure. And also Dr. Dede Kurkuk also wrote about life alert medical cases of Muhammad. And when we were talking about Muhammad, and he was very afraid of dogs, of garlic, and this kind of patient smell bad smell, and therefore he drowned himself in the rose water. And this professor told me about the patient that he has seen, that some of them react towards music or some frequency. And we were talking about that maybe this is one of the reasons that the forbidding music start from Muhammad time. But I am wondering, have you done any research?
No, I have not done any research on this, and it sounds a bit far-fetched for me for the following reason. The reason is that when you read those sections of the Quran that are referenced by the opponents of music among the clergy, they have nothing to do with music. So if there were a consensus that the Quran forbids music, the Sufis wouldn't have their Sama ceremonies, right? So I think it's all a matter of interpretation, and as I said, I mean there are a number of ayahs of the Quran that are constantly quoted by the opponents of music, and the commonsensical interpretation of ayahs is that they're not about music, right? Now, we know that Muhammad's enemies, when he was fighting the pagans of Mecca and so on, poetry has always been extremely important in Arabic culture. And that you had women and men who would make fun of him during the war and shout sort of abuse of him in beautiful rhymed Arabic, right? And that perhaps is the origin of this suspicion. But what I try to show is that in other religions you have not as strong, but you also have a suspicion of certain types of music and so on. But about the epilepsy hypothesis, I'm honestly not qualified to have an opinion one way or the other.
I don't want to suggest that there's any rational basis for eliminating music.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that the objection to music in what you described is really an objection to one of its other uses, which is dancing.
Yeah.
So the music that was allowed was music primarily the kind that was not danceable.
Yeah.
Whereas the music that was danceable was explicitly disallowed.
And
so the objection to music was primarily intended to prevent people from dancing, not the music itself. Is that? I mean, for example, even in this country, the objection to Elvis was not to his music, but to his gyrations and his hip movements, not to his music. So it seems to me that if you apply that logic as to why they thought, music leads to certain feelings and so forth, the visual effect of dancing is much more pronounced.
Yeah. And that's why Anthony Shea, who is the first anthropologist who studied Iranian music, coined the term choreophobia. Choreophobia, the phobia of dancing. And that is why raqqas has such a negative connotation in Persian and why it has been replaced with raqsande. Right. So yes, I mean music, but I think the fact music that awakens sexual appetite and sexual desire is still worse than music that makes you dance. So and of course dance can also awaken sexual desire. But on the other hand, you know, especially in the countryside of Iran, people have always danced.
To music.
Yeah, but not to music. No, you can't dance without music. Yeah, so
Eliminating music
yeah,
necessarily
yeah,
also
yeah, yeah, and that's why, for instance, in the Islamic Republic, since raqs, dancing, was forbidden, they, just as surud became a euphemism for music, harakat mawzun became a euphemism for dancing. Harakat mawzun meaning rhythmic movements. Became a euphemism for dancing. Yes, madam.
So, pre-Islamic, Persians were Zoroastrians, and there were also Christians in Iran and Iraq. When Iraq was part of Iran, obviously they have music. Do you think Islam used that ban on music in Islam to control people from going back? Because sometimes its notion is very harsh. It's harder to be a Muslim than it is to be a Zoroastrian, for instance, or Christian. Were they using that to control people?
No, because at the courts of the Caliph, you had a very active musical life. I mean, all the music that the Sassanians had at the court of Khosrow Parviz and so on was continued by the Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad. And so many aspects of Iraqi music, Nihavend, for instance, you know, the Maqam Nihavend, go back to the music of the Sassanians. So Baghdad is a successor to Ctesiphon, which is, you know, in the outskirts of Baghdad. So if they had wanted to do that, they wouldn't have had such an enormous musical tradition with I mean, Barbat, for instance. Barbat was the greatest musician of Sassanian Iran. His heritage lives on in the Islamic world.
So the Islamic Republic had this notion it was fabricated by them?
No. What happens is that the clerics were always against music, but the clerics never had a monopoly of power. Sort of.
They were using that as a power? They were using the ban as a power?
No. You see, in Islamic society, the clerics, the Muslim clerics, never had a monopoly of power. They were always the kings, the shahs, the sultans, the maliks, etc., or the Sufi orders, or folk groups where Islam hadn't penetrated, right? So music survived. The clerics opposed it, but they were not strong enough to impose their view on the society. It's only in the Islamic Republic that they eliminate everybody else, and now they can impose. I mean, Iranians, Arabs, Turks have always drunk alcohol. This is nothing new, right? Except they did it in private. Yeah. So it's once the clergy has a monopoly of power that they can impose their views. Yes.
So I'm trying to connect this presentation to one of your papers.
With what?
One of your previous papers,
Yeah.
Paranoid Style of Historiography in Iran. So in which you have discussed there are so-called historians and theorists that use some conspiracy theories or align with them. So what I'm going to ask is if there is anybody that you have found from discipline of music or cultural theorists or so on that have reinforced this narrative of music that there is some evil power in the music or it's coming from the West.
Yeah. So are there any non-religious scholars of music who would rationalize these religiously based arguments? Apparently there are. I gave this lecture in Paris a few years ago, and one student came up to me and says, Dr. such and such at hospital such and such has just proven that music is very bad for you. but I didn't follow up. So, I like music too much. So.
Is it bad for your epileptic attacks?
No, that I don't know. It's bad for, it basically, the argument, and there's truth to that, I must admit there's a truth to this argument, is that it transports you to a different world. It's something like hypnosis, right? It makes you forget about the here and now if you're a true music lover. Listening to music that you like transports you to a different realm. And I see nothing wrong with that, because the realm that I live in isn't that nice. So I'd like to be transported into a better realm. But if you believe that humans should not sever their link with the actual environment they live in, then obviously music can have that danger. It can be a drug.
So you made a point about when mullahs came to power, when they had power, then they enforced this ban on music. If we look at the Muslim world, and especially the Arab world, that's culturally closest to us, is the opposite true? Meaning that mullahs are not necessarily in power, but they're Islamic societies, and music is not banned in any form?
Well, I think, again, that's why we have to distinguish between music and music. Music is a very all-encompassing thing. In the Arab societies that I'm familiar with, Morocco has two different musical traditions, the Andalusi and the other one, right? And music in Iraq is very similar to music in Iran. Some of the maqams are common between the two. Now, Saudi Arabia is different, right? In Saudi Arabia, men dance to percussion instruments. You will not have any instruments until MBS came along. All the Islamic society, in Pakistan and India, you have qawwali. I'm not aware of any Muslim society in which there is no music, because Muslim societies are not dominated by fundamentalist clerics, and I think, I'm not sure of what I'm saying now, is that I think Sunnism is less hostile to music than Twelver Shiism. I think so. I cannot prove it, but I think it's less hostile. Yeah.
Thank you for the wonderful lecture. I have two questions, but I try to be brief. One is that how do you distinguish between the concept of charismatic and authoritative in the Speech Act itself, for instance? Given it is how it is, but I say so, right? So which eventually leads into the sort of dictatorship governance. It's the basis for that, right? So how do you, if there is a sort of chapter or something in the book that you have distinguished that. The other question is about your primary archive. It seems like you used a lot of correspondence from Khomeini and all, and I was just wondering and curious if they are even available to scholarly work, and that's very interesting.
Yeah. Well, the first one is that the question is, what is the difference, or how do I distinguish between charismatic leadership and authoritarian leadership, right? First of all, not all charismatic leadership is authoritarian. De Gaulle was very much a charismatic leader who saved his country from defeat and turned it into a permanent member of the Security Council, right? But he was elected. Not all authoritarian leaders are charismatic. There are lots of authoritarian leaders who have zero charisma, right? Yeah. No, I think Trump is a very charismatic leader. I think Trump is a very charismatic leader. He himself said, if I kill somebody on Times Square, nothing will happen to me.
But I think because he's very stupid.
Well, many charismatic leaders are stupid. But charisma, basically, nobody has charisma in him or herself. Charisma is in the eyes of the beholders. if the followers of somebody think that person X is special, and by his very essence has a right to be followed, and it is my duty to obey him, no matter what he says, and that he is above the law, and if there are enough people who believe that, then that is a charismatic leader. And there are very few of them in history. Very few. Fidel Castro was one.
These people are fanatic.
Well, yes, charismatic leaders usually are.
No, the people that
Yeah.
him and elected him, they're fanatic.
Right. Oh, the people who followed Khomeini were fanatics.
Oh.
So, you know, I mean, somebody who is not fanatic will not believe in charismatic leadership. Somebody who is not fanatic believes in elected leadership, not in charismatic leadership. It goes together.
Wow, interesting distinction.
Yeah. So, I mean, charisma is always in the eyes of the beholder. Somebody who is a total idiot for us may be a charismatic leader for somebody else. And if there are enough people who think that he is a charismatic leader, he will become a charismatic leader. Yeah? It's somebody who basically who is above the law, who deserves our obeying him, even if he does things that we don't approve of, because he is special. He has a special gift. He has a connection with divinity or whatever, right? And there are very, very few of them. The second question, my sources, well, my major treasure trove was in the 1990s. There was a very nice guy at the Iranian mission at the United Nations, whose name I shall not give you because it would get him into trouble, who got me lots of photocopies of fatwas. And so, you know, he sent me a big package with the dates and the fatwas and so on. Many of them were printed in the newspapers. I mean, I quoted from Risalat, that is available to everybody. Books have been published. I mean, these are all books that intellectuals don't see, because there is a little publishing house in Rome that publishes an 80-page treatise attacking music. You know, which intellectual in Tehran is going to read that? So you have to dig a little bit to find these things.
Yeah. Please go to the first question of her, because she was asking about Khomeini, if it was charismatic or if it was the authoritarian.
Oh.
He was both.
Thank you. We from Turkey. So in the 1980s in Turkey, there were a lot of Islamist groups who were actually using Iranian music. And they imported, but they never mentioned that they were from Iran.
Yeah.
And incidentally, also they considered instruments as haram. But then in the 1990s, they gradually relaxed and it turned into full Islamist pop. So my question is, like, what is exactly going on there? Because, like, is it export of the revolution by Khomeini's certain active strategies, or is it something like a natural course of affairs, and then like post-Islamism, something like post-Islamism taking over? What is your take on that?
Well, I don't know about the Turkish case, but I think the Iranian regime had other worries than to export its music policy to Turkey, right? So my hunch is that for these Turkish Islamists, for a brief period, before Sunnism and Shiism became an issue, Iran was a kind of model, right? I mean, when in the 1990s, I was traveling in Turkey, and I saw on the pavement, you know, the people who sell books on the pavement, lots of Turkish translations of Ali Shariati, for instance, right? So, yeah, I mean, Ali Shariati's son and daughter didn't commission Turkish translations to be exported to Turkey, right? It's the Turks themselves that did that. And then I think the idea of Islamic pop, which exists in Iran too, it comes after Turkish Islamic pop. But in the last 10 or 15 years, there has been Islamic pop in Iran. It's simply an attempt to wean people away from the worst aspects of it and give them an alternative that is acceptable. And in fact, the interplay between formerly forbidden music and nowadays encouraged music is very interesting. For instance, there is one maddah. A maddah in Iran is somebody who sings, who is not necessarily educated. Usually they're quite uneducated, but they have a good voice and sing dirges in memory of the martyrs of Shiism and so on. There is one who has a very famous song, let's put it, which is based on a song of Hayedeh, the singer, right? The famous singer who died in LA. So the categories do not exclude each other. Proponents of one learn from the other, adopt elements, and so on. It's a very fluid kind of thing, which, you know, which anthropologists have to, and do, in fact, tease out.
Thank you so much for your talk. Did you feel that there was any connection with softening of the stand on the music with the outbreak of war? With the music and its power to elicit very strong emotion, there were a lot of suruts that were talking about, you know, not necessarily nationalism, but patriotism and praising the martyrs and our brave pilots, and they were played constantly on the radio. Did you?
Very much so. It's in the paper. I cut it out for the purpose of this talk, and especially Sadegh Ahangaran was a very important. Yeah, he was a very important figure. They basically conflated the traditional nohe with surud, with the anthem. And these songs were played at the front in the Iran-Iraq war for the soldiers and so on. And they were broadcast on the radio as mobilizing music, which was at the time, again, very much criticized by the conservative ulama, right? And then I have a beautiful quote from Sadegh Ahangaran, who discusses, and the other impact that it had was that in some parts of southern Iran, Bushehr, mourning ceremonies go hand in hand with music. So it's like you know, the music, the groups in New Orleans, at a funeral in New Orleans, you have music. In Iran, in Bushehr, it's the same thing. So the martyrs of the Iran-Iraq war that are buried in Bushehr, their burial is accompanied by music, right? And so this music is broadcast on the radio. And so the Iran-Iraq war did have an impact on legitimizing sound art, not necessarily what they would call music, but sound art. And let's see, I'm getting to it because this quote is interesting. He basically complains that, hang on, getting there. Yes, Ahangaran in his autobiography writes, at the end of the war with Iraq, the atmosphere changed. Epic dirges were now out of place. And epic dirge is my English translation of these surut nohe kind of things, right? If we said death to America, no one would beat their chests. In order to keep the epic spirit alive, I decided to perform the same poems in the new form and turned to music. So he says, what I was doing until now was not music. Now I started doing music. This is the origin of Islamic pop, right? Which came out on the first anniversary of Imam Khomeini's death. Now, the first fruit of this new turn was the album Ashkafshan, which came out on the first anniversary of Imam Khomeini's death. Some objected, and we know who, and even accused me of having succumbed to cultural invasion. So even a sort of a central figure of the Islamic Republic distances himself because the atmosphere had changed. Right? Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Actually, this is not a question, this is a comment. I believe that fatwa during the history is not always related to religious concerns. You know, fatwa has always been related to
social events,
political, you know, and for that, music has not been forbidden because of religious reasons, because these authors know the power of music, and this is a way to control people and control society. And even nowadays, in such authoritarian regimes like Iranian regime, music is still forbidden because they know the power of music, and it goes beyond music, and they know the power of sound, you know, itself. Music is forbidden, and sound is always sometimes forbidden. For example, in Mahsa's movement, people were arrested and were killed because of horn hiking. You know, that's why that they believe that most of these fatwas are not related to religious concerns, and this this is a way of controlling society.
Well, first of all, my talk was about the first decade only, right? So my story ends in 1989, and second of all, yeah, I mean, why does Khomeini feel obliged to change his view? Because society isn't following, right? I mean, you can stretch a society only so far, but at one point the society no longer follows you and says, go to hell. So it's in order to keep his authority over society that he must make some concessions, right? And these are the concessions that only he could make. This is my point. These are concessions that only he could make. Yeah.
Thank you for your lecture. I have a question about charismatic authority.
Yeah.
I was interested in the sentiment of the first fatwa and the 9 fatwa sequence and how it kind of empowers the citizenry to whoever fatwa affects to interpret the music for themselves. And so I'm curious, is a feature of charismatic authority the fact that charisma is kind of like transferred to the populace?
No. The first fatwa that I mentioned, i.e. it's for the believer to decide, that is actually based in the Sharia, because the example always given is that the religious rule is wine is forbidden, right? But the rule never says this red liquid in this glass is forbidden. This red liquid in this glass can be pomegranate juice. It can be, it's called, in Persian, it's called tashkhis mawzu. It can be pomegranate juice, it can be grape juice, or it can be red wine, right? And therefore, wine is forbidden, but it's for the believer to determine whether this red liquid in this cup is wine or pomegranate juice, right? And this reasoning is also found in the first, it's traditional. Music is forbidden, but it's for you to decide whether you are excited too much or not. Okay, yeah.
Last question. What do you think that the mullahs of Iran would talk about this hair dance today in Arab country, that the women danced hair dance for Trump? What would they say?
Oh, they probably wouldn't like it. They would say, it's a sign of Western decadence and cultural invasion and all sorts of things, Iranians do. I mean, who was that? There's a male Iranian dancer who dances with his hair like this all the time. For obvious reasons, I'm jealous, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Mushkin Gala. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.